Over the course of the last decade, a group of legal scholars has generated an important body of literature that challenges some of the most cherished ideals of modern Western legal and political thought. This literature is part of a trend in legal scholarship known as the Critical Legal Studies movement, hereafter CLS. The major theoretical aim of the movement is to provide a critique of liberal legal and political philosophy, and at the focal point of the critique lies the concept of the rule of law. CLS scholars argue that the liberal embrace of the rule of law is actually incompatible with other essential principles of liberal political thinking. They thus charge that liberalism is logically incoherent and that the liberal commitment to the rule of law is implicated in this incoherence. CLS scholars argue as well that the rule of law does not exist in contemporary liberal states because the legal doctrine of those states are riddled with contradictions and inconsistencies. Moreover, some CLS thinkers contend that the rule of law cannot possibly serve the ends for which liberal theory embraces it. Law cannot perform the liberal task of constraining power and protecting people from the intolerance and oppression, so even if the rule of law did exist, it could not accomplish its liberal goals. This book is a critical examination of these CLS positions. It defends liberalism by exposing the flaws and the limitations of the principal CLS arguments. An important part of my critique of CLS is based on the idea that there are two incompatible strands of thinking within CLS literature, one radical, one more moderate. The radical strand rests on indefensible conceptions of language and social reality. The moderate strand rests on conceptions that are largely defensible but from which nothing follows that significantly damages the essential elements of liberalism. Despite these serious shortcomings of CLS, the confrontation with its literature does not provide a valuable service for liberal thought. It helps to provide liberalism with a clearer and stronger account of its essential commitments, fundamental premises, our key arguments, and limitations. After the initial chapter outlining the CLS liberalism debate, the book proceeds in the second chapter to lay out the fundamentals of liberal legal and political philosophy. The chapter has two main aims: to present an account of the idea of the rule of law and to locate the role of that idea within the wider context of liberal political philosophy. In the course of pursuing those aims, the chapter examines and seeks to resolve a central debate within contemporary liberal legal philosophy, the debate between Dworkin and Hart. The chapter interprets the dispute as one over competing liberal conceptions of the rule of law. From its examination of that dispute, the chapter develops a liberal account of the rule of law that remedies some of the inadequacies found in the work of Hart and Dworkin. The third chapter, beginning a detailed examination of the CLS attack on liberalism, examines the CLS thesis that the principle of the rule of law is incompatible with other central principles of liberal political philosophy. The chapter presents and criticizes the three main lines of argument in the CLS literature for the thesis. Two of these lines are part of the moderate strand of CLS thinking. The other belongs to the radical strand. I argue that the moderate arguments fail to subvert liberalism because they are guilty of serious non sequiturs and rest on confusions about the meaning of liberal claims. Particularly persuasive in the CLS literature are confusions about the meaning of the liberal claim that the state ought to be neutral on questions of, quote, the good, unquote. In order to untangle these confusions, I distinguish four forms of liberal neutrality and show how the apparent inconsistencies of liberal theory disappear when those distinctions are kept in mind. In addition, I contend that the radical line of CLS argument depends upon an incoherent and indefensible conception of linguistic meaning, and defend an alternative approach to meaning that it is consistent with liberal principles. The fourth chapter is devoted to the CLS charge that the legal doctrines of liberal states, such as the United States and Canada, are riddled with contradictions and inconsistencies. In the CLS literature, this charge is conjoined to the premise that the rule of law, as liberalism understands it, is incompatible with the existence of contradictions and inconsistencies in legal doctrine. CLS thinkers thus conclude that there is a fatal incompatibility between actual liberal law and the liberal commitment to the rule of law. In the fourth chapter, I distinguished these three theses associated the charge of doctrinal contradiction and examined the arguments for each. The first thesis holds that legal doctrine is a patchwork of norms deriving from starkly incompatible ethical viewpoints. The main lines of argument for the patchwork thesis are criticized as resting on a mistaken view of the kind of logical connection that exists between legal doctrines and the ethical viewpoints that underlie them. Moreover, CLS reasoning for the patchwork thesis confuses a given historical account of the development of the law with providing a rational reconstruction of it. The second thesis holds that the structure of legal doctrine can be seen in radically different ways, leading to conflicting results for individual legal cases. I show that there are two interpretations of this thesis to be found in the literature, one connected to the radical wing of CLS, the other to the moderate wing. The radical version holds that the structure of legal doctrine is, in effect, in the eyes of the beholder, and that there is no sense in which there is an objective structure to this law. I argue that under the radical interpretation, the thesis rests on a highly questionable social ontology. A detailed and critical examination of that ontology is reserved for the final chapter. The moderate version concedes that there is an objective structure to the law, but argues that structure can be drastically changed over the time by lawyers who try to extend the scope of doctrines that are present of only marginal significance within the law. Under the moderate interpretation, the thesis is acceptable and important, but I show that it is also perfectly consistent with liberal thinking. The third thesis holds that the principles that underlie legal rules are not consistently applied to all the other cases over which they claim moral authority. The principles are truncated short of the full range over which their proponents would have them exercise jurisdiction. I argue that this truncation thesis is sound and important as applied to Anglo-American legal doctrine, but that nothing in liberalism's understanding of the rule of law is incompatible with the soundness of the thesis. In fact, the moral pluralism characteristic of the liberal state leads one to expect that the truncation thesis will accurately portray the legal doctrines of a liberal state. I gotta look up this word because it shows up for like another 5 times. Truncation. Truncation is the outcome of the processes of compromise and accommodation that are essential to the functioning of the liberal political order. The fifth and final chapter examines the CLS claim that law cannot accomplish the liberal purpose of constraining power and protecting people from intolerance and oppression. The claim is shown to rest on a view about the ontology of social reality that revolves around the idea that social structures have no objective existence. This chapter shows that this idea underlies the radical arguments examined in the previous 2 chapters. I criticize the idea and its related ontology, showing the sense in which social structures are objective and explaining how law can constrain power. This phase of my argument completes the criticism of the radical views of the CLS movement. In addition, the chapter demonstrates that there is a more moderate view of social ontology in the CLS literature, but that such a view actually supports the liberal claim that law can effectively constrain power and protect people. This phase of my argument completes the task of showing that the ideas of the moderate wing of the movement are compatible with liberalism. The issues raised in the final chapter reveal an important limitation of the liberal reliance on law to protect people from the intolerance and oppression. Liberal thinkers have often exaggerated the ability of law to constrain power and thereby protect people, and that they have similarly underestimated the degree of assistance that the law needs from other cultural practices and institutions. CLS thinkers point to the many occasions when laws are designed to protect have failed to accomplish that end. Yet I argue that liberalism can accommodate these CLS points. It must be a form of liberalism that acknowledges that law is one among many cultural institutions that serve to shape the moral quality of our lives. However, such a liberalism may cogently maintain that law can make a vital contribution to the task of protecting people from the evils of intolerance and oppression. No one who reads this book should labor under the impression that it provides an exhaustive account of CLS. It examines CLS mainly from the perspective of the issues that have occupied Anglo-American legal philosophy over the last several decades. There are undoubtedly other viewpoints from which CLS can be fruitfully approached: social, scientific, legal, and other philosophical approaches. The reader should not expect this book to examine every important aspect of the CLS movement. However, the reader should expect to find a clear and systematic account of the philosophical significance of CLS and some strong, if not conclusive, rejoinders to the main CLS attacks on liberalism. Alright, Chapter 1, Critical Legal Studies and Liberalism. Got some altoids here. This book presents a sustained encounter between the two players on the scene of contemporary legal thought: CLS and liberalism. The players are antagonists. So deeply has the antagonism run that too rarely has one side been willing to engage the other in a serious and sustained debate over the deepest issues that divide them. Thus, Ronald Dworkin, perhaps the leading figure in contemporary liberal legal theory, has declared that CLS's principal arguments have, quote, have so far been spectacular and even embarrassing failures, unquote. It is not surprising, then, to find that Dworkin has devoted only a few pages to CLS in the more than 800 pages of his last two books. CLS theorists have been no more generous in their assessment of Dworkin and his fellow liberals. Elizabeth Mensch dismisses both Dworkin and John Rawls in a few lines of a footnote. Of the latter, Mensch writes that he, quote, somewhat whimsically has simply resurrected 17th century social contact theory in an effort to universalize liberal thought, unquote. A few lines later, Dworkin is disposed of with the claim that he, quote, simply vacillates between an implicit reliance on natural law theory and reliance on the inherent legitimacy of judicial tradition, unquote. Alan Freeman and John Schlegel write about liberal theorists in the same vein, dismissing Rawls, Ackerman, and Locke in less than half of a law review page. It is not strange that no serious engagement with the liberal tradition has been forthcoming in the wake of such dismissals of its leading spokespersons. In general, then, the liberal theorists and their CLS critics have been highly dismissive of one another's work. There are, to be sure, some exceptions. On the liberal side, Lawrence Solom and John Stick have written illuminating pieces in which they have taken the CLS view seriously and subjected it to unthoughtful criticism. On the critical side, Roberto Unger has significantly modified his view over the years in order to incorporate his thinking more and more of the ideas of liberalism. The fact remains, however, that the literature contains no comprehensive, systematic, and closely argued exploration of the deepest issues in legal and political philosophy that divide the two sides. This book is the outcome of an effort to fill that lacuna. It proceeds on the premise that CLS and liberal theorists are wrong in their mutually dismissive attitudes. Each side can profit by taking a more careful and systematic look at each other's claims. This is not to suggest that minds will change drastically as a result. It is to suggest that both liberals and critics can gain a better grasp of their own position, its strengths and weaknesses, its essential elements and its adventitious ones, though through a serious confrontation with the ideas of their antagonists. I make no pretense of writing this book from a perspective neutral between liberal theory and that of CLS. My perspective is committed to the basic elements of liberal legal philosophy. My aim is to show that the CLS critique of liberal legal thought fails to inflict any serious damage, that liberal thought contains the resources required for meeting successfully the challenge posed by CLS. Yet, I also aim to show that the confrontation with CLS provides liberal legal theory with a clearer and stronger account of its essential principles, its central arguments, and limitations. In this initial chapter, I sketch the outlines of the controversy between CLS and liberalism. From each viewpoint, it's treated in a highly preliminary manner. The more complete treatment and assessment are reserved for subsequent chapters. The rule of law. The CLS movement is a trend in legal scholarship that has developed over the last decade or so in a large number of law review articles and in a few key books. Its ideas have proved to be unusually controversial, leading the dean at a major American law school to declare that adherents to CLS are not fit to teach in law schools. The controversy stems in large part from the movement's challenge to some of the most cherished ideals of modern liberal thought. In particular, CLS represents a challenge to the principle central to liberal legal thought, the rule of law. The central contention of CLS is that the rule of law is a myth. Undoubtedly, I have put this contention in a form that is too crude and calls for clarification and qualification. Yet it is appropriate first approximation of the heart of the view of CLS view, and serves to draw the main battle line along which CLS has chosen to wage its campaign against liberal legal philosophy. Its critique of liberal legal thought largely stands or falls with the success of its attack on the idea of the rule of law as it is understood by liberal thought. There can be no doubt that a vital element of liberal legal philosophy is the principle that a society ought to operate under, the rule of law. Its commitment to the rule of law originates with the birth of modern liberalism in the 17th century and remains as strong as ever in the contemporary liberal theory. And the terms in which the rule of law is endorsed by liberals have remained remarkably constant throughout rather substantial changes in certain aspects of liberal theory and some rather deep disagreements among liberals themselves. In the second treatise of government, Locke expressed his commitment in In his second treatise of government, Locke expressed his commitment in these words: Quote, freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society and made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things where rules prescribes not, and not to be subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. Quote, Locke went on to argue that, quote, the legislative or supreme authority cannot assume to itself a power to rule by extemporary arbitrary decrees, but it is bound to dispense justice and to decide the rights of the subject by promulgated standing laws and known authorized judges. And the importance of the rule of law to Locke's thinking is concisely formulated in his letter concerning toleration. Quote, there are two sorts of contests amongst men, the one managed by law, the other by force. And these are of that nature, that where one ends, the other always begins, unquote. Several centuries later, Hobhouse argued for the reconstruction of liberal theory, implicitly and explicitly rejecting significant elements of Locke's early version. Hobhouse argued that the state should adopt economic policies calculated to reduce the vast inequalities generated by the operation of the market. He called for social control over basic economic resources and rejected what he regarded as traditional liberalism's excessive reliance on private ownership and the market mechanism. Yet, the ringing endorsement of the rule of law remains the same. Quote, the first condition of free government is government not by the arbitrary determination of the ruler, but by fixed rules of law to which the ruler himself is subject, unquote. A few decades after Hobhouse's classic reformulation of liberalism, Hayek repudiated the tendencies towards socialism and the state economic planning that Hobhouse's liberalism embodied, which was gaining wide acceptance in Western liberal democracies. Yet Hayek too endorsed the principle of the rule of law and even proceeded to claim that the socialist economic policies were to be rejected because they were necessarily inconsistent with it. Quote, nothing distinguishes more clearly conditions in a free country from those in a country under arbitrary government than the observance in the former of the great principles known as the rule of law. Stripped of all technicalities, this means that the rule that government that government in all its actions is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand. Rules that make it possible to foresee with every fair certainty how the authority will use its coercive powers in given circumstances and to plan one's individual affairs on the basis of this knowledge. Unquote. In recent years, Joseph Raz has rejected Hayek's argument against socialistic economic policies, suggesting that Hayek exaggerated the importance of punctiliously observing the rule of law. But it is manifest that Raz himself places great value on its observance and stands squarely in the liberal tradition when he declares that, quote, it is clear that deliberate disregard for the rule of law violates human dignity, unquote. Finally, we may cite the two most influential American legal philosophers of the last half-century, Lon Fuller and Ronald Dworkin. The work of these important liberal thinkers embodies a strong commitment to the rule of law. Fuller writes, quote, surely the very essence of the rule of law is that in acting upon the citizen by putting himself in jail, for example, or declaring an invalid deed under which he claims title to property, a government will faithfully apply rules previously declared as those to be followed by the citizen and determinative of his rights and duties. Applying rules faithfully implies, in turn, that rules will take form of general declarations. The basic principle of the rule of law is that the acts of a legal authority towards the citizen must be legitimated by being brought within the terms of a previous declaration of general rules, unquote. And Dworkin describes the rule of law in its most general form this way. The most abstract and fundamental point of legal practice is to guide and constrain the power of government. Law insists that force not be used or withheld, no matter how useful that would be, to extend ends in its view, no matter how beneficial or noble these ends, except as licensed or required by individual rights and responsibilities flowing from past political decisions about when collective force is justified. The law of a community on this account is the scheme of rights and responsibilities that meet that complex standard. They license coercion because they flow from past decisions of the right sort. Unquote. In citing this line of liberal thinkers from Locke through Dworkin, I do not mean to suggest that they all have precisely the same conception of the rule of law. There are important differences, which we shall have the opportunity to explore in the next chapter. Yet there is a remarkable similarity of conceptions and commitments, given the immense span of years and the wide divergence on issues in political philosophy that otherwise divide these thinkers. The rule of law plays such a central and abiding role in the theories of liberal thinkers because they judge it to be an indispensable institutional mechanism for securing the dominant value cherished by their tradition, individual liberty, and those values that are intertwined with it, such as toleration, individuality, privacy, and private property. The liberal believes that the absence of the rule of law, there would be no way to secure in practice the individual liberty that he cherishes in theory. The law is an indispensable mechanism for regulating public and private power in a way that effectively helps to prevent the oppression and domination of the individual by other individuals and by institutions. Law, as such, is not sufficient to accomplish this purpose, and every liberal who will also concede that oppressive laws are not only a logical possibility, but historical reality as well. But liberal legal thought holds that the rule of law is, in the world of modern nation state at least, a necessary condition for securing a sufficiently wide zone of individual liberty. Moreover, it is a necessary condition that, in practice, takes us a significant way towards the goal of preventing the oppression or domination of the individual. The rule of law can do this, according to the liberal thought, because the law has the power to constrain, confine, and regulate the exercise of social and political power. I think that's it.